Again, we're thankful for everyone's presence tonight. We're thankful for the guests we have in our audience, and we appreciate you being with us as well. Again, we're thankful for this opportunity each and every Lord's Day to be together. And that's who we are as a people, the Lord's people, gathering on the Lord's Day, every first day of the week, to engage in these various acts of worship. And so they are designed for us to draw closer to God. They're designed for us to grow as a Christian, to get stronger together as God's people. There's so many benefits from our being together in the worship services and Bible study times that we are blessed to have together. Tonight we want to consider some lessons from Job's wife. I don't know, maybe over the years, if you've sat through many studies of Job's wife. I know there's very little said, regarding his wife in the early chapters of the book of Job. And if you'd like to be turning there, we're going to focus on a couple of verses and remind ourselves of some things regarding Job and his situation and what may have caused his wife to react the way that she did to all that was going on in his life. Many sermons about Job focus upon his temptation. We focus upon the trials, the personal trials that he endured. We look at his patience. We even look in general at his life. And here's an individual who had so much was taken from him, and how he dealt with that, how he looked at that. And then you bring in his friends, and we look at how they viewed life, and we look at their worldview, if you will, and how it wasn't aligned in the way Job was to God. And so there's a great study there that we know about, and so much in the book of Job. But tonight we want to just kind of bring in our focus to looking at Job's wife and try to draw some lessons that will hopefully be of benefit to all of us as Christians. We know Job lived in the patriarchal age, and he's described in Job 1 and verse 3 as the greatest of all the people of the East. And so in introducing Job, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And then God goes through to describe the holdings of the animals and of the things that he had, and then also very many servants. And then it makes that statement that we just quoted, that he was considered the greatest of all the people of the East. And there's a number of great characteristic traits of Job and of his family, and how they were dedicated to God and doing things in the right way. But as we think about Job, he not only had all of this wealth, he had the honor and the praise of men as far as his standing in the world, but he was favored by God. And in Job 1 and verse 8, he was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. And so that's the greatest thing that we can take from an individual's life, isn't it? Just as we start thinking about Job and all that he was blessed with from the hand of God into his hand, the greatest thing that he possessed was a relationship to God. Think about that. That's what's going to endure when everything else goes away. And there's so many lessons here, but one of them is the things that we may have of the world that God blesses us with, or we heap up to ourselves, can be taken in just a moment, just a snap of our finger. Those things can disappear. But what's going to last? A relationship with God. A relationship in Christ. That's the only thing that's going to survive. That's the only thing that's going to be of any value whatsoever. Well, we know as we study and start reading in Job, we find that in chapter 1 and verse 9, Satan enters the picture, and he makes the statement, does Job fear God for nothing? Think about that statement. Does Job fear God for nothing? And so God, willing to show Job's goodness, he allows Satan to tempt Job. And then we find and read that, Satan hurls everything he can at Job. And Job very quickly then loses his wealth, he loses his children, and then he loses his health. Notice in chapter 2 and verse 7 that Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and he struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And Job, he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. You know, as we read that and we're just taken back by what he had, then we see all that he loses, and then it comes down to his health. And so, you know, he starts to realize, wow, it's personal anyway, losing your family, losing your children, and then, you know, all the other wealth, material wealth that he had. But now his health has come down to be attacked. You know, that's a reminder, isn't it, to all of us? And some days it doesn't take much, does it? If we just don't feel the best in the world, it reminds us very quickly that, you know what? Nothing else really matters a whole lot in the world. If I start losing my health, if I'm having health issues, it helps to put things in perspective, doesn't it? Because we realize this life is temporary, that we have no guarantee of another moment, but also we don't have a guarantee that just everything's going to be wonderful all the way to the end, because this world is a fallen world. And so we realize that there are things that come upon us in this life. But just imagine Job's feelings at this point, and we know that personally he's right with God, he fears God, he honors God. God describes him as blameless, just a great example of a person. But this is a test. This is a major test, isn't it? When you lose all of these things, but then your health is not what it should be. Well, notice that as Job loses all these things, we might ask, you know, did Satan win at this point? And the answer would be no. Because in Job 1 and verse 22, in all this, Job did not charge God with wrong. Isn't that great? You know, in spite of all this, it wasn't on Job's heart or his mind to, I'm going to blame God for this. But he's enduring this, isn't he? He's living through this. He's trying to deal with it. He's looking to God. He's realizing, no doubt, many lessons that we just mentioned a few moments ago that we can see on this side that, you know, when you lose all these things, you better have a relationship with God. That's what cannot be moved. That's what we cannot lose if we're dedicated to keep it. If we're dedicated to be faithful and live in Christ and be connected to God and have our faithful relationship with God. And so in all this, Job did not charge, he didn't sin or he didn't charge God with wrong. But just imagine, in his misery, he's sitting down there, he's scraping the boils that covered his body with a broken piece of pottery. In chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, just after the Bible reveals that about Job's condition and where he's at, and it gives us a picture. Notice verses 9 and 10. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. What are some lessons that we can draw from this tonight? Certainly there are some things that we could take away from this lesson, from one aspect of many, as we could look at Job and look at his life and look especially at his wife here. First of all, let's consider that obviously she emphasized the present life. And that's a challenge, and that's a temptation, isn't it? Is to only view things in this context of the here and now. And we're not thinking about the future. We're not thinking about eternity. We're not thinking about God. We're not thinking about our place in this whole scheme of things of the world and of our life and of our being and our soul. But notice Job's wife's attitude was, in these words, it seems, you know, God took everything away from us. Why do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. She too had lost 10 children. She'd lost her wealth. Now she has a husband who's got these major, health crises. Are we like Job's wife sometimes, that we place too much emphasis on the present life, on where we're at in life, and maybe it's our work, maybe it's something else that we like to do, or whatever it could be. We place too much stock, too much emphasis in this life. And so that everything, every way we feel, every way we think, every way that we act and react is according to my life in the world. But as we think about this and we think about the present, and we sing about this often, and this world's not my home. I'm just passing through. That these things are temporary. Realizing that, God sends His blessings upon the world, doesn't He? Upon the just and the unjust. And so there's so many things to think about, so many things to consider. What if we lost all that we had tomorrow? We get up and everything is gone. Think about what Job lost. Family, children, servants, material blessings. Would we be like Job's wife? Would we have the attitude that she had, that said, how can you hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. We know Job's attitude there in Job 1 and verse 21. Notice what he said there. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. There was Job's attitude. That was his view, wasn't it? I know where my blessings come from. I know how they can be taken. We know what kind of world we're living in. We know who the real battle is against, Satan. But he had that right attitude, didn't he? In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 16 through 18, Paul said there, he said, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. And so Paul is trying to get us to remember, isn't he? Look, we need to make sure that our focus is right, that our heart is in the right place, our mind is in the right place, that our dedication's in the right place. Look, this world, we're wasting away. We're aging. We're going to be going away. We're going to leave this earth one day. And notice how he mentions, this is just brief. This is just for a short time, this affliction. No doubt Job had that in his mind, especially there in that statement that he made in verse 21 of chapter 1, but also in the way that he answered his wife, realizing this is a part of reality living in the world. But then what about 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 through 8, where Paul there says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Could it be Job's wife got too comfortable in the present life? She got too invested in the present surroundings. She got too invested in what she was given by the hand of God and what her husband worked for, and all of these things, all of these blessings, and lost sight of what's really important. But here's Job mentioning these things. I didn't come into this world with anything, and it's certain that when I leave, I'm not going to be taking anything other than our soul, which again is the most important thing that we possess. And that's what Paul's saying here by inspiration. He's bringing that same point across. Godliness with contentment is great gain. And again, that reminder, we have to be reminded of that, don't we? We didn't bring anything into this world, and it's certain we're not taking anything out. But he really breaks it down. If we have food and clothing, the basic necessities, with these we will be content. What a blessing that is to think that way. Final passage on that point is Matthew 6, 19 through 21, where we're reminded in the words of Jesus, do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That connects back to this point, doesn't it? She emphasized the present life. She wasn't emphasizing the eternal life. And so there's a mistake that we can learn from the life of Job's wife. Secondly, the Bible reminds us here that she ridiculed her husband. You know, you look at this, and obviously we don't have the audio to this to hear her voice, but we can read, can't we, in the words, and get the idea that obviously she is very upset, but even more so, she is just livid, and she's directing all of this at God. And so when we go back and look at these verses, as she says to Job, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. And all along, Job had been trying to be the right example. God considered him blameless, a great example morally and dedicated to God. And even those statements that Job made that we read, that, you know, hey, I didn't bring nothing here into this world, I'm not going to take anything out. His mind was focused on that. But now we have his wife. We look at the words in that she ridiculed her husband. Instead of, what's he doing? He's sitting here scraping himself with pieces of broken pottery to try to get a little bit of relief from these terrible sores that literally covered his whole body. He needed encouragement, didn't he? He needed help. He needed someone to sit down there beside him and just be there. Instead, he was ridiculed. Instead, he was challenged. Hey, curse the one who created you. Curse the one who blessed you. Curse the one who gave you these children and all of that you've had. Curse God and die. In Proverbs 18 and verse 21, we're reminded, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. Think about the power that we know is in the tongue. He needed encouragement. He needed build up. He needed some words of hope. And he didn't get that from his wife. Colossians 4 and verse 6, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And then in Job's response to her in verse 10, he said, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Can you imagine the temptation to say something back to her? But in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. In the lessons that we recently had by Brother Lonnie Jones about relationships, and probably some things that we heard that probably stuck with us from that, and just thinking about our relationships one with another in our home. Husband to wife, wife to husband, parents to children, children to parents, and then all the others that are, where all the rest of us that are mixed in, right? Grandparents and uncles and aunts, and relationships. And trying to be there for someone. Trying to be a person of encouragement. Trying to be someone that Paul said, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer that person. Job didn't need to hear the words, curse God and die. But he needed to be encouraged. He needed his helpmeet, as God describes her, to be of an encouragement, a building up, a loving disposition, characteristic. Isn't this a reminder of our relationships? Isn't this a reminder of how we talk to one another, how we treat one another, and how we need to remember that, remember the other person. Walk in their shoes in your mind. What are they going through? What would be good for them to hear? If you're in their place, what would you like to hear from your mate? Or from your child? Or from some other relative or a friend or whoever that would be? Proverbs 16, verse 24, gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. They build up. They're good for us. And Proverbs 25 and verse 11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. And so it's all these glowing, good, warm terms that have great meaning and are good, positive terms, aren't they? All throughout the Bible. But something we must remember. Remember our relationships. Remember how we speak to one another. But sadly, Job's wife ridiculed him when he needed built up and encouragement. Notice, thirdly, she falsely accused God. She falsely accused God of causing Job to suffer. You know, we see this and we find and we know that, you know, Satan challenges God and God says, look, I'm going to allow you to test my servant Job. He's a man of integrity. He's blameless. He's a great example of a man, of a human being. When we think about this, think about how many falsely accuse God today. You know, this is common, isn't it? Something happens, someone loses there's a misfortune to them. Maybe a death of a loved one. Maybe they lose their job. Maybe it's something even, under that. There's all sorts of things that happen to us in life that come out of the blue sometimes that we're not expecting. And so often people will, God, why? Why did you do this to me? Why did you allow this to happen? Why is this happening to me? And in all this that we've been reading, Job's not going there. He's not blaming God. He realizes it's the fallen world we live in. These things come about. Satan's behind these evil things. But many blame God. In James chapter 1, we might notice, beginning in verse 13, that God is not the cause of our suffering and death, and He's not the cause of us falling into sin, ultimately. Notice, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and He Himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. And in the context here, he's talking about being tempted to sin. But think about Job and his situation. His wife is asking him to do that very thing. Curse God and die. Why? Because all of these things have come upon you. Blame God. It's obvious this is all from His hand. That's her attitude, isn't it? Falsely accusing God. But in Matthew 5 and verse 45, we alluded to this a few moments ago, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for He makes His sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. We cannot accuse God. But she did. She falsely accused God. And this is one of those lessons we take away. Because again, we see this in life and we try to help others, don't we? We try to help teach that, we live in a broken society and in a broken world. Sin is everywhere. And there's times that it's another person's sin that will harm us. It might not be our direct sin. Someone else's sin could harm us, or their ungodliness, or their devilish worldly ways in that sense. In Hebrews 2, verses 14 and 15, we're reminded that since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, He Himself likewise partook of the same things, Jesus, that through death He might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. We find the source of the evil, of the sin, of death, and all of these things coming upon mankind. And that brings us back around, doesn't it, to the situation that Job was clearly in. But notice also, not only did she falsely accuse God, but she served Satan's purpose, and that's connected really to all of these points. Serving Satan's purpose. We know that Satan works through people, doesn't he? Back in Genesis 3 and the first 8 verses, Satan used Eve to tempt Adam. We know that was a major mark in history, wasn't it? Because then sin came upon all because of what transpired there in Genesis 3. But Satan used Eve. And he made these appeals to make things look good and to make things sound good and to seem like this is of God's way and of God's will, when clearly it was for evil purposes. Satan used Judas to attack Jesus. Think about how Satan used Peter to try to hinder our Lord and to deny Him. Think about how Satan uses people today to do his work. If those things happened, and we could go back in the Bible and we see that, we see how Satan works and works through individuals, and we're familiar with those lessons. 2 Corinthians 11 is a reminder too, beginning in verse 13 through verse 15, where Paul said there, he said, "For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds." What a reminder. Paul was dealing with false apostles in Corinth. He calls them deceitful workers. He says they tried to disguise themselves as apostles of Christ. And then he makes that point, he makes that connection, doesn't he? He said it's no surprise because Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Think about Job in his illness, having all that loss come upon him and his family and his wife too. And think of what she says here in Job chapter 2. And how she says it, and what she says, and we think of this point. She's serving Satan's purpose. Because Satan wants us to throw in the towel. Satan wants us to quit. He wants us to throw up our hands and say, and curse God and die. That's what Satan wants. Why does he want that? Because as soon as we do that, we're with him. We're going to be totally committed then to Satan. We're in his fellowship then. That's where he wants us. And so he himself disguises himself. He uses, as it states here, other servants who disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Isn't that amazing? He's saying this is deliberate. Why does Paul say often, "Brethren, don't be deceived"? He says, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, be discerning, think, reason. Use what God has given us to think through things and look at things and question things and test things. Apostle John reminds us of that in 1 John 4:1. Test the spirits to see whether they are of God. And so we're warned, we're reminded, and if we all could be good discerners and be aware of this and not be naive, not let our guard down, because as soon as we let our guard down, as soon as we're naive about something, that's where those things start coming in to change us, to be less dedicated to God, to move away from God, to move away from the Bible. It changes us, it changes the church, and then the church moves away from Christ. And we know what happens there. Satan used Job's wife to try to get Job to renounce God. She echoed the words of Satan. Job 2, verses 4 and 5, Satan answered the Lord, and he said, "Skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." Think of those words, Job 2, 4 and 5. Job's wife bought into that. She fell into that. She was willing to curse God and die. She wanted Job to do that. ask ourselves a question tonight. Does Satan ever use you? Does Satan ever use us? Can we see examples or illustrations in our life where we realize, wow, I've allowed Satan to use me for his purposes, to be unkind or to be cruel or to commit certain sin or to live in an ungodly way or to practice things that we ought not to practice, to say things we ought not to say, to think things we ought not to think. So many ways Satan tries to use us. In Ephesians 4:26 and 27, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. Think of that latter phrase. Don't give Satan an opportunity. Don't let him in. Don't open the door for Satan. It's possible for us to be a puppet of Satan. In Matthew 6 and verse 24, Jesus said, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And Jesus then reminds us in His words as well, Matthew 12 and verse 30, when He said, whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. Hopefully those reminders will help us to be awakened and not be sleeping, but we'll be sober, we'll be vigilant, because the devil is like a roaring lion and he's walking about seeking whom he may devour. Look at how successful he was with Job's wife. And that's a sad instance. I mean, all these other things are in Job's. As you read the account and it starts to unfold, and here he loses his children, he loses his family, he loses all these things that he's been working and been blessed with, and then this health crisis. And then we see his wife sides with the devil. So many lessons, so many applications. You know, we might picture Job's wife as just an ugly, wicked person. That might be our description of her, but think about her position here. She was a woman, she was a wife, she was a mother. But her actions, her decision to make this decision and to speak these words, she allowed herself to be used as a tool of the devil. And she didn't stop and think about the effect that her words were going to have on her husband and upon all those that would have heard her, and ultimately on her relationship with God who created her. May we think about our life. May we think about our actions. May we think about our words that affect our family members. As we mentioned a few moments ago, whether it affects, husband, wife, wife to husband, our children, children to parents, parents to children. Let's be committed to not allow Satan to use us as his puppet or as one of his servants. But let's be true to God. Let's remember where all of our blessings do come from. Let's remember also where all the evil things come from and all the bad things come from regarding the world and Satan, who's the god of this world. And make sure that we are in a right relationship with God and strive to maintain the right attitude no matter how hard and tough the consequences may be or how life may become. Remembering it's short, God is with us. He will provide the tools as He has His Word and prayer and fellowship and so many others, all spiritual blessings, to deal with whatever the world or Satan brings our way. Tonight, hopefully, we've been reminded of some of these things regarding Job's wife. If you're with us tonight and you're not a New Testament Christian, we realize, as we mentioned in the lesson a few times, a relationship with God that can only take place through Jesus, His only Son. Jesus came, He did all the work. He took care of everything. He lived a perfect life. And that's what it took to satisfy the wrath of God and to appease God. And so Jesus took care of that. He died on the cross. He was buried, and as we talked about this morning, He arose by the power of God to guarantee us a place in heaven one day. But that's only if we obey the gospel and live faithful. Are you ready tonight to obey the gospel? To put Jesus on by being immersed in His name for the remission of your sins? If you've done that, maybe there's something you need to take care of, or you need encouragement, you need prayer. Make that known as well as we stand together and sing.